It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis. Of course, from the flight deck, and of course that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment no exception. We are extremely pleased to have with us as a guest this segment Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. It leads one of the country's most important national civil rights organizations in the pursuit of equal justice for all. The Lawyers Committee seeks to promote fair housing and community development, equal employment opportunity, voting rights, equal educational opportunity, criminal justice, judicial diversity, and much, much more. Really impressive resume here that we could spend quite a bit of time with, but just for quick background, Kristen Clark formerly served as the head of the Civil Rights Bureau for the New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, where she led broad civil rights enforcement on matters including criminal justice, education, housing discrimination, fair lending, barriers to reentry, voting rights, immigrants' rights, gender inequality, and much, much more. Pleased to have her here. Kristen Clark, how are you, my friend?
I'm good. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, we're extremely pleased to have you here. We have talked about civil rights and the issues pertaining it, especially in our culture here. If you would share with our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit about your background and why what led you to this kind of work.
Sure. So I've always wanted to do civil rights work and was grateful to have been blessed with many opportunities to do this work since I graduated from law school. I started off my career at the U.S. Department of Justice, working on all kinds of voting rights and criminal justice cases across the country. Then moved on to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was led by Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, an organization with a very long and storied history. And then had the chance to work at the New York State Attorney General's office, leading aggressive civil rights enforcement for Attorney General Eric Schneiderman for a number of years. And I'm thrilled to now be at the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is a real special organization. It was started in 1963 when John F. Kennedy, during very tumultuous times, put out a call to action for lawyers around the country to mobilize to help the government in the business of enforcing civil rights laws around the country. And there were about 240 lawyers who responded to President Kennedy's call to action. They descended on the White House for a meeting with him, and he put out a charge for them to go back and be courageous leaders in their community and bring civil rights cases on behalf of victims of discrimination. And it was that meeting, that call to action, that gave birth to the Lawyers Committee. So I feel really fortunate and privileged to, be at the helm of this special organization, doing work which was important then but remains equally important now.
Well, you're an attorney, and you're obviously very, very engaged in the process of examining and helping enforce civil rights law and just the concept over the years. I'm curious as to, in the year 2016, putting even the election aside, where are we, from your point of view, legally, socially, culturally? Where are we on a civil rights sort of continuum, so to speak? Are things getting better, getting worse, staying the same? What's your view?
We're certainly not stuck in the 60s. We've made a lot of progress throughout the decades when it comes to voting rights and work to combat discrimination at the ballot box. That said, I am really struck by some of the ugliness that we've seen play out in recent years. We've seen states move forward at lightning speed to make access to the ballot box more difficult. We've seen states like Texas put in place a restrictive, mandatory government-issued photo ID requirement for voters that has a negative impact not just on minority voters but on students, on the elderly, and on poor people. I like to start with Texas because I think Texas is almost ground zero when you're thinking about the kind of voter suppression efforts that we're up against today. Texas's photo ID law, when it was put in place, immediately had the effect of knocking 600,000 people essentially off the rolls. There were 600,000 people in Texas who did not have qualifying ID. Many of them were college students. Under the law, a student ID was not acceptable. There were many elderly people who don't drive and are without driver's licenses who were knocked off. And there were many African Americans and Latinos and poor people who are disproportionately among those who function without a passport and without driver's licenses. Photo ID is interesting. I think some people think when they hear it, oh, not a big deal. I've got a photo ID. Everyone needs photo ID. But the reality is that there are folks on the margins of our society today, people who are impoverished, people who are not mobile, who rely on public transportation and don't fly. Those are the people who are impacted by a lot of the voter suppression efforts that we're seeing today. And truly, those are the very people that we want to work on bringing into our democratic process.
Kind of getting a little bit, not really political here, but again, from your point of view, as the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, in your opinion, what has the contribution of Barack Obama as president, positive, negative, indifferent, over his administration? How do you believe, what has he added into the mix?
Well, of course, it has been, for me, a great source of pride to live to see this moment, our nation's first African-American president. I'm emotional a bit as we kind of near the bend, turn the corner and move into the final months of his tenure. I think that his presence in the White House has helped to light a spark, in a lot of young people of color, who feel hopeful about the future and are encouraged that race might not stand in the way of opportunities that they seek to have down the line. That said, I think we've also seen a lot of backlash to the fact that we have an African American in the White House. I think a lot of the voter suppression and discrimination that we see today is almost a direct response to, the fact that we have an African American in that highest seat in the nation.
Well, if you just joined us again, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Our special guest this segment, Kristen Clark. She is the president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. They, of course, are one of the nation's most important national civil rights organizations in pursuit of equal justice for all. She formerly served as head of the Civil Rights Bureau for New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, leading the case for civil rights enforcement on matters ranging from criminal justice, housing discrimination, fair lending, and much, much more. I'm curious as to, in your opinion, again, from where you sit, and let's talk specifically race relations specifically with local law enforcement. Lots of things have played out over the last several months, the last year or so. Many of those confrontations have been violent. They've ended in property destruction, death, et cetera, et cetera. Are those, in your opinion, are those watershed moments that allow a greater national conversation, so to speak, or are they more indicative of divisiveness and issues underlying the surface that we're still not dealing with?
Right. Well, let's take a step back and talk for a moment about the unfortunate, situation that we see in so many parts of the country. Police use of force, excessive use of force, use of deadly force on unarmed African Americans and African American men and boys in particular. There is so much work that we need to do to ensure that we have equitable and fair policing. I don't condemn or demonize police officers. They play such an important role in our society. When you call 911 for help, they're there. But there is still so much work that we need to do to really purge bad apples from the ranks and to purge those officers that are too quick to pull the trigger and have race inform their judgment. We have work to do to really get those bad apples out of the ranks, because I know that the vast majority of police officers in our country are committed to doing a good job. That said, I'm really pleased and encouraged by the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the activism that we're seeing in communities. I think they're forcing the nation to finally come to terms with this long-standing, unresolved problem of police violence perpetrated on communities of color. They, along with the video footage that often emerges from people who are now using smartphones to record these incidents, are helping to keep these issues alive, helping to keep the conversation going, and I think helping to create an environment where we might finally see that change that is so long overdue in so many parts of the country.
What about, just from a very general point of view, and again from your position as the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, again, I will just use 2016 as sort of a barometer or a place in time here. Do you believe, in general, our laws or our culture are more progressive when it comes to the concept of civil rights? Who's ahead, laws or the culture?
Interesting. I think the laws. I think that the laws kind of shape the culture. One example of this, I think, is marriage equality. We've seen so many states and so many people who are just resistant to the idea of same-sex marriage, and it is this historic ruling from the United States Supreme Court last year that makes clear that marriage equality is now the law of the land. That's forcing a little bit of a culture shift and a culture change that's been hard to take root in many parts of the country. So in some instances, I think the law is a driver of change, and it is one of the reasons why I do this work, one of the reasons why I believe in the power of the law as a tool to bring about social change, and believe that there's still so much work that we need to do to, breathe life into the law and achieve compliance with the goals of so many of our nation's civil rights laws.
Speaking of sort of gender equality, LGBT issues, disability rights, all kinds of immigrants' rights, etc., originally, when the committee was formed, as you said, it was focused primarily on race relations. From your position, do all of these other subgroups, so to speak, or other areas, do they take your eye off of a greater ball, or does it spread you too thin, or are you able to handle them all?
All these issues are all so important. It's really all about helping to make our nation a better place, helping to ensure that everyone, has access to opportunity and that there's a level playing field. when you come back to the right to vote, I mean, everyone enjoys equal access to the ballot box. Regardless of your race, your gender, your LGBT status, everyone deserves a voice in our democracy, and then let the best woman or man win once all the votes are cast and counted, is my view when it comes to voting. So, no, I don't think these issues are a distraction. This is all just the hard work that we really need to do to help make our country the democracy that we want it to be, the kind of gold standard, if you will, to model the democracies in other nations around the world.
Kristen, you recently penned a work, Barack Obama and the African American Empowerment, the Rise of Black America's New Leadership. Would you, for our Lewis at Large listeners from where you sit, would you define kind of the nature and what that new Black American leadership is all about, and how does it maybe differ from the likes of, Martin Luther King, obviously, and some of those that may have been well known in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, what we're seeing today, I think, is that there are no individuals that have a claim on leadership or a monopoly on leadership. What we're seeing today are activists and advocates and movement leaders across the country who are all unified in trying to make our world a better place. The Black Lives Movement, I think, is a fine example of this. There's not a lot of rigorous structure. There's no single spokesperson. It's all about embracing principles, values, and ideas that are about making the world a better place. So when it comes to Black leadership, I think on the one hand, Barack Obama's presidency has done so much to inspire folks, but a lot of what we're seeing today, I think, are young people and a new generation of people who are, standing up and speaking out and really ready to roll up their sleeves and do work to help bring about change, and willing to do that even if it doesn't come with a title or an office.
Again, if you just joined us, we're talking to Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. What about, as you look towards the future, undoubtedly, I have to believe you're an optimist and a pragmatist yet at the same time. Are you feeling hopeful that the rate of civil rights and the empowerment that you're working for a wide variety of groups, is that velocity is going to start to increase, or will it stay the same or slow down? How do you see the future from here?
I'm absolutely hopeful and very much a pragmatist. You kind of hit the nail on the head. It's important to acknowledge progress, but also important to not turn our blinders on when it comes to persisting racial inequality and discrimination. So I'm hopeful that we will continue to make progress and move forward. One area where there is a great deal of work to do is in the criminal justice arena. It is time that we end the era of mass incarceration, and we are now living through a moment where we're dealing with the effects of mass incarceration. One of the issues that we work on a great deal are barriers to reentry for people with criminal backgrounds. There are literally millions of people with criminal records who today encounter barriers accessing jobs, accessing housing, even barriers when it comes to enrolling in colleges and universities. And I know that you're in a university town, but there are vast numbers of colleges and universities across the country that ask student applicants to disclose whether or not they've ever been arrested or detained or stopped by the police. Ask student applicants to disclose any criminal convictions that they may have on their record. So there is so much work to do, but I am encouraged, and we got to keep our foot on the gas, and remain committed to all of the ideals that make our great nation what it is.
Kristen, how do you respond to those that say that crimes against African Americans, statistically by a large majority, are perpetrated by other African Americans, and yes, police crime, so to speak, against African Americans, while abhorrent, statistically is nowhere near as bad, so to speak, as the other? Respond to that if you would.
Crime is a bad thing, and we need police departments that have in place effective policing programs to help combat crime and keep our communities safe. Fortunately, we've seen some good trends when it comes to crime. Crime has been on the decline, particularly serious crimes and violent crimes. But what's happened is that we've seen a lot of communities, put in place bad policing practices that involve profiling people on the basis of race, and that often result in the incarceration of people for low-level, nonviolent offenses. I'll give you an example. We just filed suit in Sherwood, Arkansas, this week, where they maintain a system of incarcerating people for writing bad checks. In Sherwood, Arkansas, they have a hot checks court, is what it's called. And so if you are somebody who, we have a client who wrote a bad check for $28. There were insufficient funds in her account to cover that check. And over the course of the next 5 years of her life, she ended up spending 25 days in jail in connection with that bad check, and she remains indebted to the city of Sherwood in the amount of more than $3,000, and she can't pay that debt off. They continue to issue warrants for her arrest, and the cycle of debt that she is in continues, and she continues to amass more and more debt to the town of Sherwood. And her case is not an isolated one. There are vast numbers of people in Arkansas and across our country who are trapped in these debtors' prisons courts that lock you up merely because of your inability to pay fines and fees. So when you ask me about crime, what I say is we have to fight crime, and we need police departments that are fighting crime in effective ways. But too often what we see are police departments and courts that are entangled in the big business of just keeping jails and prisons filled with people who really have no business being there, and people who are disproportionately African American or Latino, and it's a travesty and one of the biggest problems that we face today as a nation.
Well, as we start to wind down here, a question for you, and that is, as you look again towards the future, is there a particular single issue, either in race law, gender law, any equal employment opportunity law, anything in particular that is sort of primary on your radar screen right now?
So one of the things that we are gearing up for this fall is our election protection program. We lead at the Lawyers Committee the nation's top nonpartisan election monitoring effort. Through a hotline, 866 Our Vote, we field calls and complaints from voters across the country. And this is nonpartisan, so we help voters regardless of their political affiliation, their race, their gender. It is all about ensuring full and equal access to the ballot box. We hear from voters who report voter intimidation inside the polls, or from voters who are being asked for photo ID in states where they shouldn't be asking for photo ID. We hear from voters who report polling site changes in communities where they fail to issue notice. So through 866 Our Vote, we do important work to help voters overcome some of the barriers and obstacles they face, all with an eye towards ensuring that every American across our country is able to participate in the democratic process.
Well, we appreciate you spending some time and your insights. Again, we've been talking to Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Hey, before we leave, could you share with our Lewis at Large listeners, how can people find out more about the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law?
You can learn more about us by visiting our website, www.lawyerscommittee.org, and lawyers has an S on the end. Or you can follow me on Twitter, Kristen Clark, JD, Kristen Clarke, JD.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and we would love to have you back on again in the future.
I'd be thrilled to join you. Thank you so much for having me today.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.